Hey everybody, welcome to yet another video. This is Thyworm, and today I wanted to talk about the dev blog from Last Epoch. The dev blog that was written, I think not even a day ago, so let's just jump right into this thing. It's right over here, and the dev blog addresses quite a few interesting topics that I thought, yeah, let's just do a small video about it, give you my thoughts and see what has changed. I'm not gonna go through the entire thing. I do have a Word file with some sort of a summary. So they're going to make affix changes, and these affix changes aim to do a few things, as you can see over here. They want to partition the affixes, and they want to make exalted items more appealing, which is not hard to do, right? Let's be honest, because currently they're really bad. Third, more offensive power from items, and 4, increased build specificity for items. In the previous patch, as the new one is released by now, the items were more generically good. They were good for multiple characters, they were just good in general. And they have done away with quite a bit of that and created a lot more class-specific items. But they've gone one step further in not only having these specific items for classes, but also specific affixes that should make it a lot more niche. And I think that is a good development. I think it is nice that if you have specific classes and specific subclasses or masteries in this case, that there is a good range of items that supports those choices. And that also makes it more interesting if you find one of those items, because they are so niche, which means that they should be very good for that specific build. So talking about the affixes first, they have made a clear distinction in prefixes and suffixes. If you look over here, the prefixes are class specific and they are offensive, and the suffixes are defensive. There's more detail over here, but what it basically boils down to that if you look now at an item, what you will see is that the prefixes are offensive and even sometimes class specific. In this case, this Primalist Relic gives you +2 to avalanche plus spell damage plus cold damage, which is a nice synergy. And then the suffixes are defensive, right? It could be endurance, which we'll talk about in a minute. It can be cold resistance. It could be life, health, dodge, whatever, right? There's a lot of defensive stuff going on in the suffixes, a lot of offensive in the prefixes, which creates a nice distribution, and they will not really compete with each other anymore. So regarding exalted items, the second goal was to make exalted items more appealing, and they basically just gave it a flat buff. They buffed these items by roughly 30% at tier 7. That is massive, by the way. If you're wondering, like 30%, that is absolutely massive. And what happens currently is if you see the old tier, it's 78% increased void damage. If you see the new one, it's 105. The main thing this change will do for me, I think, is either you have to get very lucky, but that was already the case. And if you do get lucky, it's a lot more rewarding because these affixes are a lot better than before. Or, and I think this is a much more viable use case, or you start crafting on these things quite a bit more often than you used to. Because one of the affixes is so strong, right? I mean, look at this void damage over here. 105 increased void damage. The rest is pretty shit. Critical multiplier might be good for your build, but it may not be. Chance to shred armor is not that amazing either, right? So you could say, well, I'm gonna use a few runes of removals in order to try and remove the affixes I do not want. In this case, you have to get lucky, sure, and it is RNG, but you will be much more inclined to do this and hope that you are left with the good affix that you actually need. Something I complained about a bit last video was the set affixes and how hard it was to get resistance capped, and I stand by that argument, and apparently so did the developers. I was not alone in thinking that. A lot of people thought that. And the developers agreed, and they made quite some significant changes in that regard. One of the things they did is that they completely removed all the set affix pieces. So there's no more set physical and void, or set elemental, or set dodge, set health, set whatever, right? It's all gone. And I think that is a very healthy development, because you were looking for these set items to basically combine them. And not only were you looking for them, they were sort of mandatory by how many resistance caps you had to meet, which was just a convoluted and not interesting system. And they say so over here as well. which is good. So what has happened otherwise? Well, the other affixes are a lot more buffed. You will get a lot more resistances from also passives, from skills, from other affixes. So it should not be too hard to get resistance capped in your character builds. Now there's a whole story about secondary defenses. This is nowhere really stated as far as I'm concerned, but primary defenses, I think they are the resistances, right? Your resistances are your primary defenses. Secondary defenses are basically everything else. So stuff like dodge, stuff like block, armor, that kind of thing, right? What did they change over here? Well, they introduced a new secondary defense called endurance. And endurance is your character's ability to fight through the pain. Each character will now have two new stats, endurance and endurance threshold. So endurance, when you look at it, it's basically a combination of two things. It is a percentage mitigation and it is a threshold at which this mitigation starts to take effect. For example, you have by default 20% endurance, which means you only take 80% of incoming damage to health, not to ward. And the cap of that percentage is 60, which means you can get 60% endurance capped, which means that you only take 40% of all incoming damage. But that does not apply to your entire health bar, because that would be silly, right? There is a threshold under which this mitigation applies. So let's say you're level 1, your threshold is 40. So every damage you take below 40 health will be mitigated by default by 20%. And this threshold, it scales. It will be 40 at level 1, it will be 440 at level 100. Meaning that every damage you take under 440 health will be mitigated by the percentage endurance that you have. And what is interesting here is that the threshold doesn't seem to have a cap. And that is interesting that they are flat numbers instead of percentages, meaning that in theory, at the very least, you could get, let's say, 1000 health and also 1000 endurance threshold, which would then mean that your entire health pool is mitigated by whatever your endurance percentage is. In primalists and probably in something like a sentinel, you can get these numbers up quite high. I already found a shit ton of items which have these endurances on them. Primalists have items with endurance as implicits and a few other things as well in the passive tree. So you can get up these numbers relatively high. And if your endurance threshold is basically as big as your health pool, you will get massive amounts of mitigation. There are a few more changes as well. Armor, it is now capped at 85%. It reduces the armor from hits taken or of any damage source, but it will be now a lot less effective, 50% as effective to non-physical damage sources. To me, armor never really made too much sense the way it's implemented in Last Epoch. They have basically combined armor and resistances and piled them all together, whereas in most other games armor would protect against physical damage and resistances would protect against elemental damage. And then that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you resist fire and you protect against incoming physical hits or maybe even physical spells. Not so much in Last Epoch. Armor protects against any type of hit regardless of the damage type. Now they did change this in this patch. Armor is now more effective against physical incoming damage and only 50% as effective when it comes to any other element. But still, to me, it doesn't really make too much sense from a common sense perspective, right? On a side note, scaling armor at high levels will be easier. Less armor will be required to receive those higher capped numbers. The same thing is true for dodge. The core mechanic is unchanged, but it will be capped at 85%, just like armor. And it will be easier to get there. The scaling is more linear in that sense. Shields and block, we got a bunch of new shields, which is quite interesting. I found quite a few already. These shields have more diverse implicits. I noticed that as well yesterday while playing the Primalist, making them more class and build specific. It's good. This ties to the third goal that they wanted to make the builds more niche, right? And I think that's a good development. That's a good approach to itemization, and it makes finding items more interesting. I was generally more interested yesterday and more excited about finding these new items, not because they're new, but also because they actually make sense for my build. A few other things about block: the chance is capped at 100% and new block affixes will be there on rings and gloves. So you can get not only from your shield these defensive bonuses, but also from rings and gloves. The final part is a part about minion changes. Minions are really nice to play with. I personally really enjoy things like a Necromancer build. However, when you do end up in the end game with specifically Necromancers, your skeletons, your mages, and those kind of minions and the ghosts, they're very squishy and they die all the time. So in order to counter that, what Last Epoch decided to do was basically give all minions sort of innate scaling. From level 20 to level 100 of your character level, the minions will scale, and at level 100 they will be 40% more powerful. They will have 40% more damage and they will have 40% more health. And they also consolidated a lot of minion defenses, so that it should be a little bit easier to gear for minion defenses. While these changes seem to be fine and I still need to test out some of this stuff, I do think that they're not necessarily tackling the core issue. And the core issue for me is that specifically in Necromancers, but also in other minion builds to some extent, there is hardly any synergy between you and your minions. Whenever I play a Necromancer, I feel like I have to choose between my undead army or myself. If I make myself tanky and make myself able to survive stuff, my minions die all the time because I do not really invest in minion stats, because I can't, because I need to protect myself. And in the other way, it's also true. If I want to make a strong minion army, and I always go for that, right? Because if my minions die, I die either way. So I might as well make them strong instead of myself. And I will just be running around dodging stuff. If I make my minion army strong, then I will end up as a very squishy Necromancer in the background. And I don't feel it needs to be that way. I feel there should be more of an innate synergy between the Necromancer and their minions. I'm not going to tell the developers how they should develop their own game, right? But I do feel that they should look into this and have a thought or something about how you could make a more synergistic class in that sense. Because right now the Necromancer and the Undead Army seem very out of touch with each other. I always have to make a choice and it never really feels good to play, especially in endgame. And I doubt that these changes will solve anything. Because yeah, sure, the 40% more health and damage is nice and it's multiplicative, but in the end you will still end up, I think, with the same issue, which is that you have to make a choice between your minion army and yourself. To conclude, first I wanted to say that I really appreciate these kind of dev blogs. It gives a good insight in the decision processes and into the design philosophy and what they aim to do. Second, the patch has already dropped yesterday evening. I played quite a bit of it. So after playing the game for 6 or 7 hours, after it dropped yesterday, after this patch dropped, where these changes are a part of, these changes have translated very well into the game, I would say. What I've seen from it so far is that drops and items do indeed feel a lot more impactful. They are a lot more interesting. And the same is true for the affixes and defensives and the resistance caps and everything. It seems to be a lot easier to get resistance capped. I had no issues capping my primalist yesterday and I'm only level 50, so there's definitely some room to go. So I am happy with that. I think it benefits the game. I think it also makes it a bit more beginner friendly in that sense. So that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it and I hope you also enjoyed the new patch. I'm enjoying it quite a bit so far. I'm not sure how much I will play, but I'll definitely check out the new timelines. I'll probably get my character up to level 80 or so and then make a few more videos, maybe even about my thoughts, my impressions, my experiences, maybe a build guide. You never know, guys. Thanks so much for watching. See you soon. Bye bye.